Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. It's really great to see a bunch of friends of the department in the audience, some students from MFA Art Practice, some faculty from MFA Art Practice and other programs, including Tim Rollins, Stephen Madoff, the chair of the Curatorial Practice program. So welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Thyrza Goodeve. She's an art writer and interviewer active in the field of contemporary art and culture. Her writing has appeared in Art Forum, Art in America, Camera Work, Parquet, The Village Voice, and numerous other publications, museum catalogs, and book anthologies. She's the author of Howl Like a Leaf, an interview with Donna Haraway, which was published by Routledge in 1999. And she's published interviews and essays on a who's who of contemporary artists, including Vito Acconci, Matthew Barney, Ellen Gallagher, Ann Hamilton, Andrea Fraser, Tom Friedman, Matthew Ritchie, Yvonne Rainer, the Quay brothers, and Carolee Schneeman, and many others. She is the program coordinator for MICA's Summer Intensive here in New York, and she's also taught at NYU, RISD, San Francisco Art Institute, the Whitney Independent Study Program, and a few other places. From 1995 to 96, she was a research associate at on the American Century Project at the Whitney Museum of American Art. She has a PhD from the HISCON, History of Consciousness program at UC Santa Cruz, an MA in Cinema Studies from NYU, and a BA from Sarah Lawrence. She's been teaching here at SVA since 1999 in various programs, including MFA Art Criticism and Writing, MFA Art Practice, and MFA Computer Art, and also in the BFA program in Art History. And she joined our faculty last year, and we're very glad to have her. So please join me in welcoming Thyrza Goodeve.
Thank you, Mark. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. Tonight I'm going to do a combination, introduce you to who I am, and then a little bit about basically why I call myself an art writer and not an art critic. My prologue was just to keep you occupied while you were sitting here, and I don't know if you read this, but I'm not going to comment on it. It's just one of the great pieces of art writing that I wanted to share. So, my first statement is, let me say at the outset, I am not an art critic. And this is not a polemic arguing that there is something called art writing that's separate from art criticism and art history. Obviously, it's all art writing. I don't want this to become something where people think I'm carving out something special called art writing. It's really just me talking about or describing what it is that I do. And it's as simple as that. That's why I changed the talk from the task of the art writer to the task of this art writer, me. Thank you. So I repeat, and I only say this because a lot of times I'm called different things. Sometimes I'm called an art historian. I have never studied art history. I'm not really a theorist, although I use theory. I have sort of left academia a long time ago, but this doesn't mean, as I say, at times what I write isn't art history or theory or even part of an academic conversation. So, thumbnail sketch. This is just one way of describing what I do. I write with and from the artist and the work. I seek to crawl into it. I am not out to tell you if it's good or bad, but more to listen to it and share the layers and associations that I find in it. In this sense, as a writer, I am a reader as much as a viewer and a looker. So, for instance, I published an article last year in the Brooklyn Rail on Matthew Barney's drawings, and I actually called it a possible reading of his drawings. So, let me tell you why I don't call myself an art critic. My dear friend Jerry Saltz, whose Facebook page, how many people are on Jerry Saltz's Facebook page? Usually, you know, he keeps bragging about how he's broken the record for various times. So I had this interesting and somewhat embarrassing I guess it's an altercation or whatever you call it on Facebook, where I was looking. I really love Jerry Saltz, and we're good friends, and we like to joke. And he had been writing all this stuff about Jeff Koons, and I wasn't really clued into the fact that it was because there was the Whitney show coming up. So I wrote this comment saying, "Oh, Jerry, you know, I love all your little medieval he puts these wonderful little medieval images on." And I said, "But oh God, enough with Jeff Koons." So Jerry then whammed me, and I don't think you can see what it says here. Basically what he says is he quotes me, and he says, "Thyrza Goodeve, you say this. This tells me you know nothing about what an art critic does." Wham! And so then there were 10 likes, too. That made it even more painful. So then I read Jerry's piece on Koons, and I really realized, I thought, yeah, it's true. He's a critic, you know. I'm not. If I had to write about the Koons show, I certainly would, but I don't think it would be my best writing, necessarily. And I loved the way, you know, he did it. For instance, he was able to do both the criticism and the, you know, taking into consideration all the crabbiness of all the artists on Facebook who were all going, yeah, Jeff Koons, and him at the end saying, "We live in a starker, harder art world than we did before Koons. As perfectly executed as a retrospective is, it is also a cumulative, a last hurrah of this era. Even as the era keeps going. It's the perfect final show for the Whitney's building. Artists in Koons' category no longer even belong to the art world. In fact, a retrospective confirms that the art world doesn't belong to the art world anymore." And I just thought that was, you know, a wonderful, you know, it comes at the very end of it. So, who am I? I am a product of a theoretical time, basically the 80s, when theory was what, you know, it was really sort of the high, I don't know, it wasn't a high point, but it was the moment when that's really what you did and that's what you studied when you were in graduate school. In fact, the graduate program I went to called the History of Consciousness program, and please don't think that means that I know the history of consciousness. It's just the name for a theoretical and interdisciplinary program that was started in the 60s, actually, and then kept the name to it. So, as I say, my time was a very theoretical time, and in fact, the 80s, I've started to realize, has become rather a forceful moment of key originary texts and authors. Since so much today is still relevant and read by students. Now, I'd love to have a talk about theory and what that is at some point, but I won't do that here. I just want to plug theory and say it is a lovely space. It is a generative space. And as this quote, if you've had a chance to look through it, it's just a basic Wikipedia beginning of what theory is. The only thing I would change at the very bottom is where it says the idea that a theory is thoughtful and rational explanation of the general theory of things. Irrational theories are good too. So my statement about theory is it's not a drag. It's not irrelevant. It can be fun and creative. Most of the time, bad theory is just the product of bad writing or bad teaching. So that's part of one of the sort of polemics behind my, my talk. But I'm very much not a fan of theory as bludgeon, you know, theory as illustration, right, or power play. In fact, I'm not a fan of theory which alienates or separates. For me, theory is full of play. Simply put, I like stuff that makes sense of the world I live in because theory and practice are not oppositional. We've said this many times, but it's like we can't seem to remember this. It keeps coming up. So we need better language here. So I teach in the art practice program, and I have a wonderful colleague named Stefan. Whoops. Kitties. Well, that's to show you the theories about play. I like cats, of course. Stefan, while he was teaching his seminars this summer to the art practice students, he started to get very frustrated by people complaining yet again, oh, we have to read so much, oh my God, how can we make our art, and blah, blah, blah. And it's obviously a real dilemma, right? But I love it, he decided to create our logo for the program, which is called Minking, or Mink Differently, or something, or Mink Different, I guess would be the way to do it. So in tongue-in-cheek, I want to invoke that what I do as a writer as well is also a form of minking. All right. Now, in terms of writing, I just found this wonderful quote that, again, I won't read the whole thing, but I want you to be able to read it because it sums up a lot of the reasons why I've come to call myself a writer. Aside from the fact that I write. It's actually from a film historian, which is interesting because I have a master's in cinema studies, but so you wouldn't really think that this would be where you'd hear about writing. But the quote comes from a book actually that was written about the brothers Quay, and in it he says, the writer is not tied to the physical concreteness of a given setting. Therefore, he is free to connect one object with another, even though, in actuality, the two may not be neighbors either in time and space. And since he uses his material, not the actual precept, but its conceptual name, he can, or she, can compose his images of elements that are taken from disparate sensory sources. He does not have to worry whether the combinations he creates are possible or even imaginable in the physical world. We understand now why the writer can fuse the rustling of the wind, the sailing of clouds, the odor of rotting leaves, and the touch of raindrops on the skin into a genuine unity. So writing is obviously a form of making. It is ever producing. One can write about anything, especially in contemporary art. That's why I got really excited about writing about contemporary art, because it's a way to write about anything and everything. Writing does not end. Writing is always a place of beginning and continuing. And writing is always, but for me very much, the writing is always about the word, the specific word. It is not just about message. It is not about content necessarily. I mean, it is, but not necessarily. It's not just information, but it's all about the way that message is articulated. In other words, to state the obvious, it's about writing. Writing as an activity of making is a kind of sinuous snake that takes you where you never thought you would go because you couldn't get there until you were writing. It is why I think artists should write in graduate school. I think that we, in our practice, we make the students write a lot during the year, read and write and post, and I think it's really become quite fruitful for people to start being able to articulate their ideas. And in honor of that, I was really happy to get this response last week from one of the people in the art practice program, where basically what he says is that all of this reading and these stream of associations is too much for me to apprehend. I find myself wishing more and more that I had taken more time earlier in my life to learn, to practice and learn the art of writing. The irony is this is one of these people who really can write, but those are always the people who then think that they can't because they know how complicated it is. Maybe it's not the words per se that fail me, maybe it is more accurately my inability to assemble them so as to conjure, and this is what I liked, the sense of electric urgency that forces them out. The idea that that's why, that's why I write, that electrical urgency in trying to articulate it. Not always to say that you can articulate it, but that's where writing, for me and for others, I think, is very productive for artists as well, and not just for people who are writing. So, but how did I get here? Little autobiographical interlude. I was always writing, but I was never thinking I was a writer. I was the one as a kid who would tell ghost stories to others over campfires. I'd get my play put on and, that I wrote in 8th grade class or published in school literary journals. But in general, I was a kid without an identity. I never really thought of what I would be. Nobody really asked. The mother of one friend thought I was funny and would be an actress. I always wore outrageous clothes, surprise, surprise. Was very theatrical. My dad thought I might be an artist. My mom figured I'd marry someone with money, poor soul. Ambition was something I knew nothing of. I was a drifter, adapting to my milieu, which was comfortable, but by no means an intellectual, artistic environment. If anything, it was sporty. To be honest, my one God-given talent was skiing, and my dream was to be a ski bum and ski the Tasman Glacier. I don't think I could stand on skis now for very long, but that's the truth. So everything changed when I was 17 and was fortunate enough to go on a term abroad in high school to the American School of Tangier. At 17, you are at that critical moment when for the first time you have to make a decision about who you are going to be or what college you're going to. It's that, that nervous year that some of you as still remember, or parents who are taking your children through it. It's sort of like, where I go to college, it's going to mean it's going to be my whole life, and if I don't get into this and that and so on and so forth. It's not necessarily true. But I was clueless during the fall of my senior year. I was an okay student, but there was no particular college I was striving for. I was basically just doing rock climbing and hanging out with my friends and doing crew and opening up all their letters of acceptance to all the Ivy League schools. So by my senior year, I came back when I returned from Morocco, and I was a totally different person. It's where I became who I am today. I was surrounded by adults, mostly expatriate writers, via my luck to be introduced to Paul Bowles. I would go to his apartment every night, and I met this character named Mohammed Murabit, who of course fell in love with me because I was a sweet, chubby, virginal, blondie girl. Who was clueless, absolutely clueless, because he's really quite handsome, right? And I was always like, Murabit told endless parables, and he translated them into books. He took me around Tangier, and I would sit watching him play parcheesi in beach cafes, smoking keef. In the evenings, I would go back to Paul's apartment, and Murabit would tell me a story translated by Bowles. He and Paul wrote to me for several years after I left. It was really quite sweet. I mean, it was really because I was so naive and had no idea who he was that we had a lovely correspondence. And then the more I found out who he was, the more I read about him, the more awkward my letters became, the more kind of pretentious. And it's just
Thyrza, I think there are a lot of people who've never heard of Paul Bowles.
Oh, sorry. Paul Bowles is one of the great writers of the 20th century. And composers. There's a terrible film called The Sheltering Sky that was based on his brilliant book called The Sheltering Sky. And he hung out with Gertrude Stein in Paris. Gertrude Stein told him to come to Morocco in the 20s, and he stayed there ever since. So he died there in the 2000s. And he was a man who many people went and saw, and many people have corresponded with. It was part of his quality. As a person, he was very very diffident, very unemotional, warm, but everything, sort of nothing was going to kind of rattle him very much. But he had this amazing capacity to connect with people and especially young writers. And he's one of the few people I mentioned who, along with Christopher Hitchens and Truman Capote, was able to write a first draft and not edit it. He just typed out his stories, and that was it. But as I said, too, he was also a composer. So thank you for letting me clarify that. So it was the social context of being around writers and storytellers, because writers were making from the world that we were living in. Before that, I was kind of living life. And all of a sudden I went, oh, life can be something you can make from. So I began to keep a compulsive journal. I began to write in a different way for a different reason. And I also began to read and read and read and begin to make. So, how did I become an art writer without studying art history or even knowing much about art? Resume building, just this is stuff that you heard from the opening, so I won't go through it. But this is sort of my pedigree. And what happened was in 1989, Donna Haraway, because this was as I said, this was the era of theory was very hot in the art world, and many people thought art form was, had just gone to the dogs because they were having people who were theoretical, right, like Paul Virilio and so on and so forth. So they'd asked her to contribute to this wonderful issue that was called Wonder. And Donna said, I really don't have anything, but I have this graduate student. It was just an incredibly gracious, wonderful moment. So I wrote my first essay for art form. This is how complex it was, where they were playing with all sorts of graphic design at this point, but you can sort of see where the different people that are in it, and I'm at the very, very bottom with this insanely long title that goes on and on and on, and they also did me a great disservice. I put this up here because I've never been able to Xerox this and pass it out, even though it was the first piece of writing that I did, because it was, so anyway, someday it will be published and it will be different. So it's very significant for a lot of reasons that this is what I published. I really wasn't a writer yet, and so even though I'd always been told I wrote well, and in graduate school I wrote well, but I wasn't really a writer yet, so it was a great experience to work with the editors there. I sort of came in with these fragments and these things, and we stitched it together, and I started to understand what writing entailed. And I have learned so much from working with editors and now myself have become one. And find it a wonderful skill. So if ever you're asked to rewrite something, don't take it personally. You're not Paul Bowles or Christopher Hitchens. So everything I have learned actually about writing comes from writing for others, as opposed to writing for myself. In other words, not caring what others thought, except in terms of the ideas, as in graduate school. I mean, the worst writing I ever did was in graduate school. Just embarrassing stuff, right? And for some reason, in graduate school, they don't teach writing or work with writing very much, even in English programs. It's a very interesting conundrum. So I learned how what I thought I said and what I put down were not always the same thing. The process of elucidation and perfection was exhilarating to me. But here's where, ironically, writing this article made my destiny. Because I was published in art form, suddenly I was asked to write on art. In other words, it is when I became an art writer, but my essay had nothing to do with art. It was an essay on postmodernism, lobotomy, and multiple personality disorder. It's so 80s, right? But luckily I did. I continued to publish and was asked to write more and more. I wrote about Rosemary Trokel's animal videos. I wrote an essay on wounds in Art Forum. And by 1994, I had left Santa Cruz, moved back in 1994, had finished my dissertation, and I moved back to New York, and I was an art writer by then. And that's when and I was going to show you a picture of my dissertation, but I forgot. Yes, that's it. That's what I wrote. So 1995, another moment when things changed. I was asked by Jack Pankowski of Art Forum to interview Matthew Barney, who I had absolutely no idea who he was at the time. He was very young then. He was just starting out. And some of my best work is usually with something I'm not familiar with, because it's that process of discovery that I love. And I continued to write about Matthew Barney for a long time. I've written about 8 or 9 different things on his work. He challenges me as an art writer because I was actually supposed to do the main essay in the Guggenheim retrospective that Barney had. But a couple of things happened. One, 9/11 happened and my brain was mush. And 2, I couldn't figure out how to write an essay. His Cremaster series, if you don't know it, is, it's this epic piece of artwork that goes from 1994 to 2002. It involves videos, it involves sculptures, it involves books. It's extraordinarily complex in terms of the imagery, and on and on and on. And it's about the idea of art as potential. It's about the evolution of something to the moment just before it is formed. So he uses in that the metaphor of biology. The cremaster muscle is what you guys have and I don't. It's what controls the rising and lowering of the testicles. And to write an essay about that, which was Matthew Barney's cremaster cycle is about, really was something I felt I couldn't do. And so I tried writing dialogues, I tried all these things, and they were not at all appropriate for the catalog, so I got kicked out. But it's really fun. I'm still seen as an author on a lot of the Amazon sites, so that's kind of fun. So I wrote about Matthew for Parquet, and this was another moment when things changed for me. Louise Neary, who now is, deputy director at the Gagosian, whatever we call it, was the best editor I've ever had, because she was very creative. She would come to me and say, I'd been babbling about research I was doing at the Whitney on vaudeville. I became obsessed with vaudeville for some reason. And she was like, I want you to write about Katie Nolan and vaudeville. Now, this is my Matthew Barney first piece. This is the Katie Nolan. Now, who in God's name would ever put Katie Nolan and vaudeville together? But it became really fascinating. So she then continued to ask me to write. I wrote about Raymond Pettibone, Jeff Koons, Sarah Morris, all sorts of different things. And I really loved that period of writing for Parquet. It was a very creative time. So I branched off from Parquet and wrote probably one of the crazier things I wrote was in this insane magazine called Trans, which this issue came with all sorts of bells and whistles and balloons and different sort of toys with it. It was quite crazy. And I wrote an essay, which I don't know if you can really see, but it's called Archives and Gyms, and Muscles and Archives. It's in Spanish, so of course. It's basically about sports in the work of both Matthew Barney and Vito Acconci. And I had great fun because it's an essay that's quite visual. That writing you see is Vito Acconci kept his own wrote his own sports magazine when he was around 8. And this is from his sports magazine, and I have pictures in there of these baseball players that he wrote. I mean, it's to die for. It's just wonderful stuff. So I was able to do that. Into the 20th century, I started to, continue to write on artists and subjects. And if you want to know more or care to, You can look at my stuff at academia.edu. I'm in the process of putting my stuff together to put it into a volume of writing at some point, but until then. So then something started to happen. The more I wrote as an art writer, the more I wondered. If I'm an art writer, what does that mean? What is my task? Why do I not call myself an art critic? Remember me and Jerry. Remember the Arnheim quote about writing. The writer, as he says, is able to connect things that don't normally go together, or don't have to be present at the same time in the physical world. I mean, one of the great things that writers can do is, make these preposterous arguments, and if they're clever enough and they can do it, it's convincing, but sometimes, they're pushing the envelope, right? But it's through the process of writing. So this idea of to connect things that don't usually connect. Why surrealism has always been something that's compelled me so much. And as an achievement, I've always loved it because of its literary and cinematic forms. I'm very sorry to say that I think the art historical surrealism is the weakest aspect of this very extraordinary movement that is international. There's so much to talk about. It's so limited. Anyway, so just to show you, I wrote an essay on Marika More called Cyborg Surrealism, which is a little bit kind of gimmicky. It was based on a concept that came from Donna Haraway, and this is because I had taken out the English version of the article from my Parquet. Parquet is wonderful. It publishes in German and English. This is how you say cyborg surrealism in German, in case you need to know that. So, the task. I'm sure many of you by now have gotten my allusion to Walter Benjamin's essay, The Task of the Translator. It's an essay you might read in graduate school. If not, it's available online. And it's very interesting because for him, the translator is not there to mimic or copy what he's translating or she is translating, but is out to transform language. In particular, he or she uses the language that they are translating to transform the language in which the translation takes place. So I have this quote, "The task of the translator consists in finding that intended effect or intention upon the language into which he is translating, which produces the echo of the original." So that intended effect. You might want to take a look at John Ashbery's recent translations of Rimbaud's Illuminations and look at various translations of Illuminations to see what different kinds of translations are. And then he has this great moment where Benjamin says, aiming at that single spit where the echo is able to give in its own language the reverberation of the work in the alien one. So you're getting at the reverberation of it. And then he has this long but lovely quote. Fragments of a vessel which are to be glued together must match one another on the smallest details, although they need not be like one another. Do you disagree?
No, it's amazing.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, he's pretty great. In the same way, a translation, instead of resembling the meaning of the original, must lovingly and in detail, and this is really important, incorporate the original's mode of signification, thus making both the original and the translation recognizable as fragments of a greater language, just as fragments are part of a vessel. Now I'm going to skip to over, and this if I'm going to turn this into an essay at some point, and I talk about a class I taught, and I talk about ekphresis, and I talk about Walter Benjamin, but I think it's a little bit too much to go into here, so I will pass over that. and ask the question then, how do I characterize what I do? What is it I might be seeking to describe or translate when I'm writing on art? Now, obviously, to say an art writer is a translator is going to cause all sorts of problems, so don't take me literally on that. But in some moments, I think that is what is happening. But what we're trying to translate is something that who better than our friend Marcel Duchamp has come up with. And it's his way of describing the creative act and what art does. So he has this concept called infrathin, and Alex Hammond, because you were writing about it in your AP thesis.
I think Huffy is.
Yeah, I know, he is too, but when you were reading about it, that got me interested in it, right? So thank you. I actually didn't know about it, which probably, see, it shows I didn't study art history. And infrathin is this concept that is impossible to define, which is great. One can only give examples of it, as he says. The infrathin is in general a separation, a gap, the difference between two things. It is about delay. So the infrathin is in general a separation, a gap, the difference between two things. And he gives this wonderful example, which is it's the warmth of the seat after someone has gotten up from it. I think that's what art is, right? Sort of what that is, that warmth thing. And he also says it's when tobacco smoke smells also of the mouth, which exhales it. The two odors marry by infrathin. It's a separation between, this is amazing too, the detonation noise of a gun, very close, and the apparition of the bullet hole in the target. So if you're shooting at a gallery fair. So he wrote in his essay, The Creative Act in 1957, and you can get this, there's this wonderful thing called brain pickings. It's a wonderful blog that this woman who's she reads constantly, and she takes apart things and she puts them on for all of us to digest. And she has the entire talk that he gave in 1957, and she also has it recorded. So if you want to go see it, and it's wonderful to hear him speaking it. So in that article, he writes about that art is the difference between intention and realization. What art is in reality, he later commented, is this missing link, not the links which exist. It's not what you see that is art. Art is the gap. And then I was reading about it in another blog, and this person had a nice way of putting it. The gap in between, the liminal, the non-retinal, stretch the limits of articulation. When the definitive properties of known words fail, there is always the possibility of invention. And that's the exciting part. Art stretches the limits of articulation. I love that. The art writer, or what I'm interested in, is working in that gap in the stretches of articulation. One of my favorite pieces by Monsieur. So simply put, and I'm coming towards my end, good, because I didn't want to talk too long. This is the space in which I write. It's that minuscule difference that makes an artwork art, that the art writer, as opposed to the critic, grasps and tumbles into. And again, I don't mean to make it like there's critics that do this and art writers do this, but everybody's an art writer. But at the moment that you're being a critic, you may be doing this and you may not, but it's not necessarily your task. Your task is to make judgments, is to come to terms with the artwork. So So I'm interested in grasping and tumbling into the art, not to decode it, but to ride along with the artist and the artwork. Simply put, search for the warmth of the seat left by the artist after the artist has gotten up. Simply put, sorry, I repeated myself. As I said, seek for that minuscule difference. Grab and try to stretch, even mimic the limits of articulation that that piece of artwork is about. Tease it, chew on it, tickle it, and see if it will come out. Allow the art I am writing about, and I think this is the most important, to affect and force me to invent how I will write about it. And that's why writing about Barney's Cremaster was so difficult. And I've done a lot of research on writings on Barney, and they often are very experimental because his work sort of lends itself to that, and that's a whole other conversation. But there's a lot of incredibly interesting writing that's been done. So art writer as minker, as medium, I write with rather than on or about art and artists. That's how I describe what I do. So, final thoughts. So, of course, this has been my way of introducing you to what I do, to my minking, but it is also something else. For one, I want to thank Mark for including me in the artist talks, because often art writers aren't part of this. You know, I've really never had to do this, and it's been really wonderful to have to come together and talk about it, because to use that word, writing is my practice. But I think that by virtue of Mark inviting me here, he's starting to break down that boundary that I'm so frustrated by, that writing's over here, and thinking's over here, and theory's over here, and art's over here, and makers are over here, and blah-de-blah-de-blah. Certainly that's true, and many people do that, but it doesn't have to be that way. As I've said, all of this can be, another way to think about reading and writing and thinking is, it's creative intellectual imagination, and that's a way to think of theory or philosophy. So the more I teach MFA students, the more I think writing and reading is something misunderstood, as if it is not creative or isn't an avenue to the creative. And this is also the fault of the way writing is often introduced to people. Courses are usually structured as writing your artist statement, grant writing. I mean, this is all, I don't mean to put this down, this is all very important. Or, God forbid, if you have to write on something that you've read and quote it, you have to write an academic essay and it takes your soul away. No, you don't have to write that way. That's what I'm here to, I hope, help people with when they write. You may and you may not, but in our theses we have in the art practice program, we've had a lot of interesting experiments. Things are still researched. There's still thinking behind it. It's not impressionistic, just poetic thinking, but you incorporate it in a creative way that doesn't necessarily mean you're making an argument. Now, this is harder to do, actually, than write a straight essay, so just beware. Like, poetry is much harder to write than anything else, even though everybody seems to think they can write poetry. So, no, as the task of this art writer is to write about the infrathin, i.e. more as a collaborator, or as I put it, who's talking? I write with rather than on or about art and artists. So the task of this talk has also been the hope that artists, too, will begin to see writing as friendly, even when critical. Creative, or as Bill Berkson put it in one of my favorite pieces on art writing called Divine Conversation, Art, Poetry, and the Death of the Addressee. So I thought I'd end with reading parts from an essay that is coming out soon that I wrote about Bill Berkson. He is a poet and art writer who I think of as my mentor. I love what he does because it's the way he uses language that's so compelling. And so here's a bit just from this piece I wrote. I first heard divine conversation, art, poetry, and the death of the addressee as a talk given at the School of Visual Arts several years ago. It is now republished in For the Ordinary Artist and serves appropriately as the gateway to the rest of the book. Since that time, I've read and I've reread this essay. I sent it to numerous friends, and I've used it as the initial text in one of my classes on art writing. When I first heard it in 2008, which is quite a long time ago now, it was one of those talks that both glued me and lifted me off my seat. Glued me to and lifted me off my seat. And it was given here at SVA. Not only did it intersect and affirm so much of what art had always meant to me, but the opening paragraph unknowingly tapped almost verbatim into a conversation that I had been having that week with an artist whose work I had written on. So here's a quote from Bergson. This is how he starts it. My theme tonight is conversation. Conversation and its discontents, you might say, or discontents of which I am maybe one. So tempting is it to become a scold. But I'll try to avoid that. Conversation may be the intense, extended talk people generate among themselves, a kind of telepathy between the things some people do and those others who don't find them interesting to confront. And then the things that follow from that, and so on everywhere. I mean the ongoing exchange of gases in and out of the body that you hope never ends and know to be brief, unruly, and meant to be enjoyed as such. This is me continuing. The theme of telepathy in friendship of conversation that you hope never ends, as gases in and out of the body, was precisely what had been spoken between me and the artist that same week, as if our private ongoing exchange between writer and artist was now being channeled through Bill, who was up there reminding us all at that very moment how art is not just about looking at objects, but looking within the context of a series of relations. And a phrase I love that comes from an Yvonne Rainer film, risks between you and me, a field of social gathering. As he put it, continue the conversation is a prompt I've heard more or less at my back for most of my writing life. The phrase implies a continuum of art as a field or social gathering, across which possibilities move, change, emerge, and reduplicate over time, not necessarily in chronological order, and with the understanding that no mode, old or new, can ever be said to be dead. I really like that because it really makes me frustrated when people say, oh, that's just over, that kind of thing. Especially when it's like Freud or Marx. So the conversation that never stops, the readiness of response within a field of others, the open sociability towards the addressee, a continuum defined as a social gathering where possibilities move, emerge, and reduplicate over time, where no mode, old or new, can ever be said to be dead. Divine conversation brings together everything that makes Bergson so singular. Remember, this is an essay that's written for a volume that's about him. As well as what makes art writing at its best, and I don't mean, I think I have to change this. I say no simple act of criticism. Well, no act of criticism is by any means simple. So I do take that back. But is an exegesis on our lives in art, as well as the role art has had in our lives as an action, a behavior, a moral image is what he calls it, which is a phrase he learned from the writer Edwin Denby that he uses again and again. So language, the whole article comes off of this wonderful quote that I've used quite often from Roland Barthes, where he talks about language as a skin. I rub languages at the tips. I rub at the tips of my fingers. So the name of this is called Bill Bergson, Language at the Tips of His Fingers. So language is a skin that is rubbed, fingers at the tips of words. Isn't that the best? Gases in and out of bodies. Art unfolds, quote, as you look and as you look to comment on it or listen to whoever is looking alongside you at the same time too. Here is the readiness in response to an object or situation as a quality of attitude. There's a beautiful description of attitude in de Kooning's work in one of his essays. The attitude of the lover, writer, and beloved, language, art, friends, in their everyday exchange. And from this, what Bergson receives is, quote, the beauty, order, and passion generated from talk and mutual contemplation itself. So, in a way to summarize, not power conversations, not academic gamesmanship or art world finagling, but looking with educated eyes and with contemplation, between and with self and other, where mutuality, cast in the everyday, is what produces the vibratory suspense of revelation. So I think we can end there in the vibratory suspense, the infrathin, in that zone of stretching the limits of articulation. So I thank you for coming. That was in Brooklyn Rail asks people to be a guest editor at various times, and I was asked to be the guest editor for the specific issue that was celebrating the year after Sandy, the Hurricane Sandy. So I thought about, well, what does a hurricane do, and what has it done to us? And I thought, well, certainly it makes us feel vulnerable. So I probably wouldn't have necessarily had that as my topic if I, it wasn't for that issue. Because I got into some hot water with my dear friend Mark Deary, who said he wanted to come tonight but couldn't, and I wish he could, who was like, I hate this vulnerability. I hate when people talk about this. And I wasn't meaning that. It wasn't about, I am vulnerable and I write. It's that, you come across an artwork that, in a way, it makes you vulnerable because you don't quite get it. So it's that kind of vulnerable. And you can either choose to say, it's junk, I hate it, or wow, that really fascinates me. I think there must be something else in there. So that's what I was talking about, the way that art can affect you that way. I know, I'm not quite sure, I think, but it's an image that this writer, Edward Denby, uses. And it's the idea of almost an ethics between all of us who are in the same social sphere, a kind of moral image that we carry with us in terms of our attitude towards art and each other. It's from Elaine de Kooning as well. It's all about that. But I love it as a phrase, but I'm not quite exactly sure what it means. But I don't think it's anything as a contract. It's more that thought cloud that's behind us, the kind of moral image that we carry with us, some of us. So, yeah. So there was a question in the back. Well, it's very good because it's my way of dealing with that gap. And what I like about it is it doesn't mean there's an answer. That gap can be filled by very many other kinds of ways of articulating it. So, but that's the place that I want to move into. But it's certainly not to say, oh, this is the definitive, reading of this artwork. But, it jiggles something in me. I mean, when I want to write about something, it's sort of physical. It's like, oh, that makes me want to write about it. And then it's sort of investigating what that is at times. Yeah, free associating too, yeah. But not necessarily decoding. I mean, it can be, yeah. So I started to write dialogues. I wrote a rather wacky dialogue about Matthew Barney's work. where I had him play the part of an hysterical testicle. It's something I don't know if it's successful. It's only short now, but if I worked on it more, it might be fun. But just trying to find other ways where you're not just saying, as I said, this art is about. And the reason I'm saying all this is because sometimes I find it hard to publish my art writing, where to publish it, because it's not really academic, it's not really criticism, it's not really whatever, I don't know. So it was really me trying to figure out, well then, what the heck is it that I'm doing that does feel like it fits in a in-between space. So that's really the only reason that I'm yakking on about this, and also because Mark asked me to. So it's been great. It's been very clarifying, to help. Yeah. Oh, indeed. Please come. I had the best time with the MFA Fine Arts people, as you all know, last year in that class. Well, it's a theory class. I do find that word, so off-putting. I don't like that I'd become defensive about it either. But I have. I don't have in my head exactly what it is that my syllabus contains, but it's a combination of reading sort of things that you should know, sort of things that are canonical, and then theoretical elements that I think are particularly interesting and fruitful for artists. And what I do in the class is we read these things as artists, right? You pick out what works for you and what stimulates you. And it's to be inspired by this writing, not to be bored, frustrated, pissed off, angry. So I make a point of only assigning things where I respect the writing. I'm not, jargony, I call it graduate student theory writing is horrible. And as I said, it's usually about bad writing, people not really thinking about the words that they're using. And jargon becomes a very easy, lazy way. And I did that all through graduate school, so I know. So it's about contemporary, theory and art, but it's also open. I will introduce the class by showing the syllabus, and we did this last year, and then we will all talk about certain aspects of maybe there's certain things people want to either read or know about, because at this point there's so much, it's impossible, right? So some people might want to do more on feminism, some people might want to do more on science studies, some people might want to do Deleuze, God forbid. And on and on, and some, and also some new person who I don't know, because there's always new things coming up. So there's plenty of room to do it. So I try to have a good time. Is there writing expected with the class? Yeah, it's a good question, because last year it was not for credit, so there was none. This year it is for credit, so I haven't really thought about it. I have a feeling I will probably ask people to, what we'll probably do is use Canvas and have a post where we post, and people share, and it's almost like a journal, and it's not to write essays, but it's to all talk back and forth about the work each week. And then certain weeks I'll ask certain people to be responsible for something so that they come in with ideas. And then I think the final project would be more doing something that's relevant to you as an artist in whatever way that is. And again, not to make like, there's just some horrible illustrated Deleuze art that's just painful. So it's not to do that, but to see what comes out of it, And it may not even seem like it's coming out of the class. I don't know, but it's to keep you making art, and at the same time learning where writing, like that student who I quoted said, it really is helping me, if I could write better, because there's this force that comes out when I'm seeing something, or I'm feeling something, or I'm reading something, and I want to be able to get at that. So the writing is very much in note form, diary form, whatever. I know because a lot of artists are artists because they're not writers. So obviously I take that into consideration. Artist writings that I love. I love Ronnie Horn's writing, obviously. This is writers. I mean, exactly. There's that great generation of Smithson and Akanchi, and so on and so forth. I love the book that's the edited book of collected artist writings that Christine Stiles put out. And I think it's really wonderful for you all to read artist writings to see, again, some are manifestos. I mean, sometimes I make people write manifestos. That can be a lot of fun. Sometimes it's just autobiographical. Carolee Schneemann, I've gotten to know and been reading, of all things, her cat writing. She has collected her cat writing for 40 years, and it's astonishingly well written. She is a great writer, and it's not something she's known for. If you want to see this, you see it in this big, fat, collected letters of Carolee Schneemann that's really kind of ugly and pink, but it's very thick, and she has a way and a facility with language. Yvonne Rainer, too, are wonderful writers. So. Really, I don't like all theory, but the stuff that I like is I like it because it makes sense of the world that I'm living in. It makes sense somehow to me. I try to get that across. And Nietzsche's a wonderful example because as a philosopher, and as a writer, he opens up a space for the way thinking can be playful, funny, about affirmation, about exploration. So, I obviously include philosophers within that. But I applaud you for trying to do this because it's very hard because there's such a reaction now against theory, and for good reason, because a lot of people have been taught it where it just doesn't seem relevant. And maybe you don't need it, but it's also, my course is a place to come to let your mind go, right? Because you're making all the time, making. And I think that in MFA programs, there's so much making and critiquing that you almost, don't get to kind of look out the window and think of something interesting and that kind of thing. Sergio was in the program when I was an instructor, and he was very surly. And the last thing I would ever have thought was he'd become a lawyer. And he said he did it as an art project, right? He's created this wonderful exploration of art and law. And it's also it's the way he teaches it. He gave a talk to us in art practice, and it was just fantastic. He made law really interesting. So maybe it's about teaching from an artist's perspective in a way, knowing you're teaching artists and you're not teaching. Academics are in there for a different reason, and then you get into slicing arguments down and stuff. But the Whitney program was great, formative for me in the early '80s. And then when I went back to teach there in the late 90s, I got into all sorts of hot water because I, at that point, was really sick of academia and sort of the way things were talked about and the tenseness, and there was a kind of theoretical right and wrong and all of this. And God forbid I wanted, that was when I first was interested in Matthew Barney's work, because it was just like, whoa, what is this? At the time, it was so different than the kind of pictures generation work, the kind of art as critical art kind of thing. and I just was really freed by that. And I was seen as a kind of enemy or a, not rigorous any longer, not political any longer, all of these things. So the Whitney program is fantastic. If you get in, it's great. But I think there's, it's only for a certain kind. And I think now can be, really be, put stuff, give things a bad name. Sorry, Ron. I hope it isn't about that it stops you from making. I hope that you can join it with your making in some way. And even if you can't, this is what I always say, when you read Virginia Woolf, do you then go, I got to apply this to my art? No. So you're just reading this stuff to exercise muscles. That's also how I think of it, right? So it's really that, it's really that. Well, I think they shouldn't be separate because anybody who's writing should always be thinking about the craft of writing and what they're saying and how they're saying it. So it's a kind of obvious point. I really brought up the theory stuff because I knew I was going to be teaching the class here, and that's why. But I think it's very important because if you're using, because theories like art, you're often trying to get at something that's very hard to articulate. So that's why people come up with words. And sometimes you really need that jargon. It's the only thing you can use. And that's great. Use it judiciously. But it's that same, trying to create a concept, right? Or whatever it is, yeah, so. I would say like the people who I respect, like, as theorists, like somebody like Derrida, obviously it's all about writing, and I read him more as poetry than I'm not a philosopher. So they go together. And I don't know if this is interesting to you, but I know that the way I was taught a lot of theory was all about you read the text and you're not supposed to know anything about anybody. And I've been learning so much about the intellectual history and the background of especially all the people, the French theorists of the 80s and 90s. And it's so fascinating, and it makes so much sense out of their work. So I try to bring that in too. It's very, not cool to do, but I do it. Like the fact that Derrida is an Algerian Jew, is very interesting in terms of what he ended up creating in terms of deconstruction. And so I like to make the writer a person. And with a pedigree too, and where do they come from? What are they doing? So it just helps, or to know that Althusser was a student, was the teacher of Derrida. I didn't know that. He didn't really. So anyway, Lord, I don't really want to talk about all that. So, but it's there. It's a good conversation to have, and I'd like to have it more. But. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mark.